You are listening to the Norton Library podcast, where we explore classic works of literature and philosophy with the leading scholars of the Norton Library, a new series from W. Norton that introduces influential texts to a new generation of readers. I'm your host, Mark Chirino, with Michael Von Cannon producing. Today, we present the first of our 2 episodes devoted to Upton Sinclair's novel, The Jungle, as we interview its editor, Kenneth W. Warren. In part 1, we discuss how this muckraking novel came to be, the effect that this novel has had on the food we eat, and how Sinclair's politics inform this great novel. Kenneth W. Warren is Fairfax M. Cone Distinguished Service Professor in the Department of English at the University of Chicago. He is the author of What Was African American Literature? So Black and Blue, Ralph Ellison and the Occasion of Criticism, and Black and White Strangers, Race and American Literary Realism. Kenneth W. Warren, welcome to the Norton Library podcast.
Mark, it's great to be here. Thank you.
Such a pleasure to have you on to discuss Upton Sinclair's The Jungle. And Ken, maybe we should start by talking about Upton Sinclair himself. Who was he and where did he come from? What was his background? What do we need to know about him?
He described his early childhood as a member of a poor branch of a fairly wealthy Southern family as crucial to the development of his sensibility and his outlook. He lived with a father who was actually an alcoholic who struggled with keeping the family afloat. And he was able to see what it was like to be in proximity to wealth even when he didn't have any. He said it was his fate from his earliest childhood to live in the presence of wealth that belonged to others. And he attributed that experience as, in essence, making him a socialist before he ever became aware of what socialism was.
So did this manifest itself, these ideas about class and wealth, through writing, through activities, his personal life, or did he mostly just explore this as a writer?
Through every phase of his life. That's one of the things that's really kind of remarkable about him. Certainly through his writing. Sinclair was extraordinarily prolific, although we know him now most prominently from The Jungle. He wrote over 100 novels, and he actually won the Pulitzer Prize in, I think, 1943 for a novel, Dragon's Teeth, which was actually focused on the rise of National Socialism in Nazi Germany. But all of his writing, in some sense, was concerned with inequality, the problem that the poor and the working faced in relation to great wealth. This was not merely his literary passion; it was a political passion, and he was, as we say, a card-carrying socialist, an early supporter of Eugene Debs. And by the 20s and 30s and 40s, he was running himself as a candidate on a socialist ticket when he moved to California. He actually ran as a socialist for a campaign that actually garnered national as well as international attention. So his political views were pervasive. They defined his writing, they defined his politics and his actions and his relationships with his family.
Ken, where did Upton Sinclair grow up and around what time?
He grew up in Baltimore. His family was from Virginia. He spent time in New York, and his early adult life was basically in the Northeast. And this was in the latter part of the 19th century. And among the things to keep in mind about this moment when he was growing up is that this was part of the moment that we know as the Gilded Age, which meant the vast rise of economic inequality. The number of millionaires in the United States grew dramatically during the course of his youth and early childhood, and the identity of the nation, the democratic nation, became almost inseparable from the identity from the claim about dramatic economic prosperity.
So when he publishes The Jungle, is Sinclair already established as a prominent writer, or is it really The Jungle that turns him into a literary celebrity?
The Jungle does really mark the advent of his celebrity as such, but he had written novels before that moment, novels that didn't quite catch on. The most prominent being a novel called Manassas, which was a Civil War novel that he thought and felt was continuing in the vein the vein of literature and social criticism that Harriet Beecher Stowe had established in Uncle Tom's Cabin. The novel didn't produce the kind of interest and excitement that he had expected, so he was, as a novelist who had real ambition, somewhat disappointed by that. But really, it was The Jungle that put him on the map as a novelist. He was, however, I guess the other thing to keep in mind, identified as a socialist prior to writing The Jungle, which accounts for the fact that it was a book that was published in the socialist journal Appeal to Reason.
Can you put into context what Sinclair being a socialist at around the turn of the 20th century would mean, as opposed to what it would mean if a novelist called himself a socialist in the 21st century?
That's a really good question, and a really good thing to think about. Among the features of the moment when Sinclair is becoming a socialist is that there is a heightened attention at this moment to economic inequality. This was also, by the time he's writing, the moment that we call the progressive era, when liberal reformers were becoming, crucially aware that without some check on the growth of American industry, the plight of working people and their capacity to live decent lives. I mean, it was difficult, and there was reason for a great deal of pessimism. So socialism, in some sense, even though it was connected with a certain amount of radicalism, it existed in the progressive era as part of a broader sensibility that American society did have to do something about its working class as a whole, the number of immigrants who were coming into the country to fill the ranks of a growing industry, and who were being clustered, whether it was in New York or Chicago or other industrial centers, in slums that were noxious and not conducive to living a decent life.
So is it possible that Sinclair's novel, an unapologetic socialist view, it wouldn't be dismissed in 1906 out of hand? It would be considered just as having a particular political bent, as opposed to, let's say, today?
Yeah, absolutely. Because one of the interesting features of the Jungle as a literary and a political phenomenon was the interest that people like President Theodore Roosevelt showed in the novel. Roosevelt was understood himself to be a progressive. He had actually taken a particular interest in the quality of meat that was available to the American public as a result of his military career, where he purportedly saw meat that was intended for the troops, exposed on I think it was on the deck of a ship, and obviously spoiling. And the question was raised about how many troops in the U.S. troops in the Spanish-American War had been sickened by inferior or spoiled meat products. And so Sinclair was someone who could send a copy of The Jungle to Roosevelt with the expectation that it wouldn't be dismissed out of hand, which it wasn't, and could be used in some respects to bring to bear some degree of regulation on the meat industry. Roosevelt felt, without necessarily embracing, well, I shouldn't say necessarily, without at all embracing the full implication of what Sinclair's socialist politics were. So Roosevelt was not someone who had to run immediately kicking and screaming from his association with Sinclair, although he did have to manage that very acutely in the effort to actually get some measure of regulation passed.
I'd like to talk to you a little bit about Roosevelt and how this novel landed in just a minute. But before we do, is there any information about how Sinclair happened upon this topic as fertile for exposing a wrong in society and making it the substance of a novel?
One of the things to keep in mind was that Sinclair was hardly alone in turning the lens of expose on American industry. This was the era of the muckraking journalists, Lincoln Steffen's Shame of the Cities, Jacob Riis, How the Other Half Lives, being some examples of this. And other writers, activists, as we would call them now, had been very much aware of the horrible state of the meatpacking industry. And Sinclair had actually written an expose that caught the attention of the editor of the Appeal to Reason. And so, in some sense, the writing of The Jungle was actually kind of writing on spec to a certain extent. Can you do something? Can you fictionalize this in a way that will have some real effect on the American public?
So it started as journalism or an editorial?
Yes, it's journalism. Yes.
And he fictionalized it to become The Jungle.
Yes.
When we're thinking about The Jungle as expose, doesn't it seem like Sinclair is exposing a lot of wrongs, not just the ills of the meatpacking industry and the quality of the meat, but also labor conditions and the way immigrants are treated and women and on and on and on? It seems like there's quite a lot of things in this entire cosmos that Sinclair is describing that need to be reformed.
Well, absolutely. And he was adamant in turning his attention to the lens of his criticism on the meatpacking industry. He was not making an argument about the singularity of meatpacking as an ill within American society. It was, in his mind, a particularly sort of graphic instance of the problem of capitalism. And he had intended to, and indeed did, go on to looking at mining, looking at journalism and other industries in terms of their corruption and their role in reproducing the horrible inequality that was characterizing the life of working people in what was a increasingly wealthy nation, that wealth being distributed dramatically upward. So yes, meatpacking was in some sense just an example.
It seems like, Ken, when you're writing a novel like this with Sinclair's motive in mind, that one of the worst things you could do would be to exaggerate your point. Because if your novel then had the reputation of being sensationalistic, it would lose all credibility. So do we have a sense of how realistic the depiction of the meatpacking plants and all of the practices of those businesses actually were?
Yeah, absolutely. Sinclair was aware that the meatpacking industry and the politicians that supported that industry were on the lookout for any criticism, widespread criticism of their labor practices, but particularly of their quality control or their lack thereof. And so they were more than ready and actually worked very, very hard to discredit the account of their practices that were depicted and fictionalized in the jungle. So Sinclair spent an extraordinary amount of time. He was a great journalist, documenting every charge that went into the book. When the book first came out, and there was a concern, when the book was being published, and there was a concern about its accuracy, the publisher sought to, verify what Sinclair had written. And in the first instance, an quote unquote independent investigator came back with charges that, most of the charges that the book had made were egregious and exaggerated. But a truly independent investigator came back and showed that everything that was in the jungle, with the exception of the implication that on occasion a worker who had fallen into a vat that was rendered into lard, that actually happened. There was no evidence for that. But for all of the charges that the book leveled against but for all of those charges, there was ample evidence of the accuracy of the depictions within the jungle.
So when the book is published in 1906, is there significant blowback or lawsuits? Did the Beef Trust collaborate to have a public relations campaign, or did they know that they were beaten by all of these observations and by the power of this narrative?
They fought back. There was no simple conceding to the accuracy. They fought back in every way that they could, even when it became clear that the public outrage at the quality of meat products was going to demand that there be some level of government or congressional action. And the battle in both the House and the Senate to actually put in place regulation was, fought tooth and nail, over the course of the year after the jungle was published. Could say one clear success with respect to changing practices was the passage of the Pure Food and Drugs Act of 1906. So there was some real legislation that had immediate positive effect on the meat packing industry as a result of the debates and the inability of the meatpacking industry to simply sweep all of this under the rug.
Yeah, you say immediate. It's the same year that that The Jungle is published, which is unheard of, that a novel would cause the United States government to act this quickly. Could you distill what the specific complaints were that were addressed in that legislation? Because The Jungle seems to expose lots and lots of things that you wouldn't wish would happen in that industry.
I can't enumerate all of them from the, I probably should have listed them from on the top of my head, but a couple of things that stand out had to do with regulating practices for disposing of injured or diseased animals, making sure that those animals were not included in the, you couldn't just sort of sweep them into the pile with everything else. And among the other things that the Act addressed was the question of dating of products as well. So it was moving, in some sense, you could say it was the Act addressed those matters of meat production and canning and distribution that struck the public as most unacceptable. This was, Sinclair realized, as sort of in the aftermath of what he was able to achieve through The Jungle, that this was the moment when the American consumer really begins to emerge in U.S. political life as a super powerful force. If industry is going to expand, it needs to be able to sell its products to an expanding market. And the question of whether people would buy inferior products is something that industry couldn't be indifferent to. So for Sinclair, among the ironies of the reception of the jungle was that it produced reform with respect to the practices of the meat industry. It did not move the political meter in the way that he wanted, and he's famously known for saying that in writing The Jungle, he aimed at the heart of the American public, but instead hit its stomach.
Yeah.
And I didn't quote that exactly, which is to my discredit, because among the things that Sinclair is known for is his capacity to sum up political reality very, very effectively.
That's so interesting, Ken, and about the difference between the heart and the stomach. We were talking that one of the dangers of writing a muckraking novel like this would be to be inaccurate.
Yes.
Another trap that Sinclair could have fallen into, I think, would be to be excessively emotional or sentimental. If we can talk about the specific family that Sinclair uses as kind of an avatar to guide us through this industry and the process of immigration and labor and class. And first of all, do you think Sinclair falls into that trap where he is really trying to tug on our heartstrings to the disadvantage of the novel itself?
Yeah, that's a really, really good and a really important question. I've already mentioned Uncle Tom's Cabin, and this is a novel, Stowe's novel, which is known, by a lot of people as a sentimental novel, a novel that, as you say, pulls on the heartstrings of its readers. A pejorative account of sentimentality is that it's unearned emotion. That is to say, you use stock incidents, stock characters that will evoke tears from readers, and you don't have to do anything really to create the complexity of the reality of the moment. Sinclair actually did not have a highly negative opinion of Uncle Tom's Cabin. In fact, he saw it was very, very effective. And so in trying to write a novel that would do for socialism what he felt that Uncle Tom's Cabin had done for slavery, he was willing to use the entire arsenal of characterization and incident to put his audience in the correct position. That being said, I don't think that I would describe the power, particularly the early part of the novel, as he focuses on the family, the Lithuanian family with Jurgis and Una at its center, as described by sentimentalization as such. The early power of the novel, I think, has to do with actually his capacity to render accurately, again, and effectively, the lives of the family and the extended family and the workers around them as they sought to try to create, a place of decency for themselves and their children, under the horrible conditions that the meatpacking industry and its control over the American political apparatus and over the ancillary industries, including housing, made impossible. So, what we're being asked to feel, I think, is not unearned emotion at any point along the way. It really is emotion that is actually, you could say, the outrage, the sadness that one feels as a reader is actually justified at every step of the way.
So the plight that this family goes through, and they go through so many different travails as the novel goes along. I mean, is this just a microcosm of the tragedy of everything that Sinclair saw in this process?
Yes, it is. I think that's a good way to describe it. I mean, the wedding that occupies so much of the first part of the novel when we get introduced to our major characters was the result of him sitting, as he said, he had the facts. He had done the research and he had the facts. What he didn't quite have, as he said, was the story that he wanted to tell. And seeing a wedding feast as it was taking place, and just watching the people involved in it and how they were interacting with one another and trying, at this moment, because a wedding is a moment of social affirmation. It is the new generation coming together with the support of the older generation and the support of the community in order to start a new life. It's a place where traditions that have existed in the past are renewed as a way of guiding people into the present and into the future. And Sinclair was absolutely able to see that it was this, it was the sort of the substance of what it is to sort of produce a kind of human and communal life that was being at every instance undermined by the shadow of how we're going to pay for this. What is it going to take for, each individual who's taking time out of their life to affirm life in order to make up for what they're losing by virtue of trying to be fully human in the way that they understand themselves.
Yeah, the wedding is an unforgettable sequence in the novel. I'm also wondering about the way Sinclair characterizes women. And can you tell us a little bit about the women in the family and what they go through and how they add to Sinclair's presentation in the jungle?
Yeah, it's really interesting. I mean, there's Jurgis's wife, Una, and then the cousin, Maria Vershiniskus, who represent the possibility of sort of, you'd say goodness, truth, a certain kind of indomitable character. Maria at the wedding, I mean, she ends up becoming engaged to the fiddler, Tamushis, who seems almost like a comical character in some sense, because he's described as sort of just vigorously and almost violently playing the songs that the wedding feast requires, and poking people with his bow as he's playing. But Sinclair is actually able to make us feel the dignity of what he's actually trying to do, and what he's actually able to do, because in the moment that he and his fellow musicians are playing the songs, they're able to lift people like Maria out of the sordidness of their surrounding into a sense of belief, tradition, and community. And that's in some sense what the women, you could say, what they represent as a possibility, which makes then the fact that for all of these families, women have to work. They have to work in the same industry. Their work in that industry makes them subject to the predatory behavior of supervisors around them. And despite their desire to be good wives and good mothers, they find it virtually impossible, if they want to contribute to the success of their families, not to violate the oaths and the norms that they're deeply committed to. So they become, in some sense, one of the instances where one can see how thoroughgoing the oppression of an unbridled capitalism is, because they show that no human relation or no set of human relations can be held sacrosanct under the conditions that these Lithuanian and other immigrants are being subject to as they try to become successful American citizens.
Kenneth Warren, thank you so much for joining us on the Norton Library podcast to discuss your new edition of Upton Sinclair's The Jungle. Thanks, Ken.
Thanks, Mark.
The Norton Library edition of Upton Sinclair's The Jungle, edited by Kenneth W. Warren, is available now in paperback and ebook. Check out the links in the description to this episode for ordering options and more information about the Norton Library, including the full catalog of titles.